Do you fear you are nothing more than a line in a ledger, easily erased by those with power? In this world, your very pulse is a commodity. Follow Julian Thorne to learn the one secret to surviving a market that wants your soul. The gavel didn't strike wood. It struck a slab of cold, industrial steel, echoing through the cavernous gloom of the abandoned Bowery station like a gunshot. Julian Thorne stood on a makeshift dais, his silhouette framed by the flickering amber of ancient mercury vapor lamps. Below him, in the shadows of the rusted tracks, 3 men cowered in plexiglass cages. They weren't criminals or saints. They were assets. Julian adjusted the silk cuff of his bespoke charcoal suit, his eyes as cold and gray as a London fog, scanning the digital readouts flickering on the subway walls. Each man had a device clamped over his carotid artery, a pulsing red LED counting down the seconds of their lives. To the billionaires watching from the velvet-lined darkness of the VIP mezzanine, this wasn't murder. This was high-frequency trading. Julian checked his Victorian silver pocket watch, the rhythmic ticking the only sound that mattered. "Gentlemen," he whispered, his voice a razor-edged caress. "The opening bell has rung. Bid on the endurance or bid on the expiration, but do not bore me with hesitation." Julian's journey from the glass towers of Canary Wharf to this subterranean hell had been paved with the corpses of smaller men. In London, they called him the Butcher because he could dismantle a conglomerate with a single phone call, leaving nothing but bone. But the thrill of the Vitesse 100 had soured. Numbers were abstractions. Blood was liquidity. He had moved to New York to find a more visceral market. Here, beneath the skin of Manhattan, he had built the dark exchange. It was the ultimate expression of radical capitalism. He targeted the invisible, the undocumented, the debt-ridden, the forgotten, and turned their remaining time into a derivative. The billionaires loved it. It was the only rush left for men who owned everything. The power to bet on the exact moment a heart stops beating. Julian watched the bidding climb on the LED screen. 60 seconds of life for Elias, a former hedge fund manager who had lost everything, was currently trading at $4 million. "Look at him," Julian said, pointing a long, pale finger at Elias, who was clawing at the glass. He spent his life selling futures. Now, he is the future. The cruelty was the point. Julian didn't just want their money. He wanted to prove that humanity was a myth. He believed that under enough pressure, any man would liquidate his neighbor to buy himself a minute of oxygen. To Julian, the Victorian pocket watch he held was the only god worth worshipping, a precise, uncaring measurement of destiny. He felt a surge of cold electricity as the bids spiked. This was the IPO of the flesh, and the margins were spectacular. But as the countdown hit the 10-second mark for the first asset, Julian didn't feel the usual satisfaction. He felt a craving for something more volatile. The market needed a shock to truly reach its potential. It needed a crash. He signaled his guards to bring out the special listing. The atmosphere in the station shifted from predatory excitement to stunned silence. These weren't the usual desperate souls. These were the brothers, sons, and wives of the very billionaires sitting in the mezzanine. Julian watched the color drain from the faces of his American partners as the lights flickered onto the new cages. This was his masterstroke, the ultimate liquidation. "You've lost focus," Julian projected, his voice booming through the tunnel. "You've forgotten that in a true market, no one is untouchable. To save your own lives, to stop your own clocks from starting, you must now bid the organs of your kin. A kidney for 10 minutes. a heart for an hour. The horror was a symphony to his ears. The butcher had moved beyond the stock exchange. He was now trading in the very architecture of the soul, and he was the only one who held the gavel. As the first billionaire screamed in protest, Julian simply smiled, a thin, cruel line on his pale face. He didn't care about the money anymore. He cared about the purity of the collapse. He watched as the men who thought they were gods began to scramble like rats, forced to choose between their greed and their blood. The air grew heavy with the smell of ozone and terror. Julian opened his pocket watch one last time, the silver casing cool against his palm. He wasn't just a broker. He was the architect of the end. The market was crashing. The screaming had begun, and Julian Thorne was the only man in the room who knew that the price of life had finally hit zero. He prepared to record the most successful trade of his career, the total bankruptcy of human decency. The air in the cavernous, derelict depths of the City Hall station was thick with the scent of ozone, damp stone, and the metallic tang of impending slaughter, a suffocating atmosphere that clung to the lungs of everyone trapped within its subterranean confines. The flickering industrial floodlights, hooked up to straining portable generators, cast long, jagged shadows against the graffiti-strewn tiles of the Victorian-era station, illuminating the special listing. A row of reinforced, soundproof glass cylinders suspended above the tracks, like macabre, high-tech ornaments of a forgotten age. Inside these transparent coffins, the wives, children, and siblings of New York's elite. The very people who had dined in the penthouses of the Upper East Side only hours ago, clawed at the reinforced glass, their silent screams muffled by the humming machinery of the dark exchange and the rhythmic dripping of stagnant water from the ceiling. Julian Thorne stood on the elevated platform, a figure of glacial authority that seemed to drain the warmth from the room, his presence alone silencing the growing panic of the men below. He checked his Victorian silver pocket watch with a slow, deliberate motion, the rhythmic ticking serving as a metronome for the carnage to come, a sound that felt like a death knell in the oppressive silence of the tunnel. The billionaires below, men who had once commanded global markets with a single, ruthless keystroke and moved trillions with a whisper, were now reduced to trembling animals, their wrists shackled to the bidding terminals that monitored their own aortic countdowns via glowing red LED displays. There was no exit from this labyrinth. The reinforced steel blast doors had been sealed with industrial-grade thermite charges that would incinerate anyone attempting to breach them, and the entire network was air-gapped from the world above, ensuring no signal could reach the surface. This wasn't a mere hostage situation or a crude kidnapping. It was a closed, perfect ecosystem designed by a master of market mechanics, a pure exchange where the only currency left was the biological integrity of those they claimed to love. Julian's gaze swept over the crowd, his steel-gray eyes devoid of even a flicker of empathy, seeing not human beings, but depreciating assets in a state of terminal decline. The stakes were absolute and binary. The timers on their chests were synchronized to a neurotoxin release system buried deep within their own veins, and the only way to delay the inevitable was to authorize the liquidation of the flesh suspended above them, turning their family members into the ultimate margin call. Arthur Sterling, a hedge fund titan known for his iron stomach and a history of dismantling corporations without a second thought, was the first to break, his face a mask of sweating, blotchy terror as his countdown dipped below the 5-minute mark, the red numbers pulsing against his skin like a digital heartbeat. Above him, in a cage labeled Asset 04, his daughter, a girl of barely 19 with eyes full of uncomprehending horror, pressed her palms against the glass, her mouth forming the word "Daddy" in a silent plea that echoed louder than any scream in Sterling's mind. Julian watched the flickering data on the central LED board with the detached, analytical interest of a biologist observing a cell under a microscope. His thin lips curled into a smirk that spoke of a deep, intellectual satisfaction. "The market is volatile tonight, Arthur." Julian's voice echoed through the tunnel, smooth and terrifyingly calm, cutting through the low hum of the station's generators and the distant, frantic sobbing of other captives. "Sentimentality is a luxury for the solvent, and as I look at your terminal, you are currently bankrupt in time. Do you bid, or do you expire into the history books as a failed investment?" The mechanism Julian had engineered was a masterpiece of cruel, automated precision. A series of surgical lasers were positioned within each glass cage, calibrated to perform the extraction with terrifying speed the moment a bid was confirmed on the terminal below. There was no way to hack the system, no way to negotiate a better deal, and no way to delay the transaction once the sell order was executed. Julian had spent years perfecting the algorithms of this exchange in the shadows of London and New York, ensuring that every legal and physical loophole was cauterized with the same efficiency he used to bankrupt his rivals. The billionaires couldn't call their lawyers. They couldn't bribe the guards who stood like statues in the shadows with assault rifles, and they certainly couldn't appeal to Julian's humanity, for he had traded that away decades ago in the pits of the stock exchange. The impasse was a perfect circle of suffering. To live, they had to mutilate their legacy. To save their legacy, they had to die. It was the ultimate short squeeze, and Julian Thorne was the only one holding the margin. The frantic, rhythmic tapping on the terminals grew into a cacophony of desperation, a digital symphony of betrayal as the first trades were finalized, and the surgical lasers inside the cages began their silent, glowing work. Julian didn't flinch when the first spray of crimson hit the interior of a glass cage, obscuring the face of a terrified woman. He merely adjusted the cuff of his bespoke charcoal suit, his expression one of mild, professional satisfaction, as if he were watching a successful IPO launch. The butcher had calculated the psychological breaking point of every man in the room with frightening accuracy, knowing that the primal instinct for self-preservation would eventually devour the thin veneer of civilization they had spent their lives cultivating. The station's old PA system crackled with the sound of a digital auction hammer, a sharp, mechanical clap that signaled the closing of a deal and the transfer of life minutes from the cage to the terminal. Each 10-minute extension was bought with a pound of flesh, and as the night progressed, the market was quickly becoming saturated with the price of survival. The billionaires tried to pool their resources, to find a way to buy out the system by offering Julian their entire offshore fortunes. But he had already anticipated the formation of such cartels and rendered their wealth meaningless. He introduced variable interest rates into the game. As the night progressed and the desperation grew, the cost of time would double and then triple. A kidney would soon only buy 5 minutes, then 2, then a mere 60 seconds of breath. The realization hit the room like a physical blow, a wave of cold reality that silenced the begging. They were in a race they could not win, trapped in a deflationary spiral where their very bodies were the hyperinflated currency of a dying market. Julian stood as the central bank of this nightmare, his aquiline nose silhouetted against the glowing screens like a hawk watching the rats eat their own young in a cage of their own making. He was proving his ultimate thesis, that under enough pressure, the human soul was nothing more than a series of tradable commodities, and that even the most powerful men on earth were merely slaves to the ticking of a clock they no longer controlled. As the air grew heavy with the copper scent of blood and the frantic, sobbing prayers of the damned, Julian felt the familiar, intoxicating thrill of the perfect crash approaching, the moment where the system becomes so overloaded that it collapses under its own weight. The chaos was no longer just in the bidding. It was in the eyes of the men who had just signed away the lives and limbs of their kin, their humanity leaking out of them with every frantic press of a button. They looked up at Julian, hoping for a sign of a bailout, a moment of mercy where the game would end and they could return to their penthouses, however broken and scarred. But Julian Thorne didn't believe in bailouts. He believed in the absolute finality of the ledger and the purity of the bottom line. He stepped toward the edge of the iron platform, the Victorian silver pocket watch chain glinting in the harsh, artificial light, and raised his hand to quiet the room, his presence commanding an immediate, terrified silence. "The IPO phase is over, gentlemen," he announced, his thin lips curling into a smirk that promised nothing but total ruin for everyone involved. "We are now moving into the hostile takeover phase of the evening. The timers on your chests have been accelerated by 400%. The price of survival has just moved from non-vital organs to the heart itself." A collective gasp of horror filled the tunnel, followed by a sudden, violent tremor that shook the very foundations of the subway station, dust falling from the ceiling like gray snow. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the sound of the secondary containment doors locking into place, sealing them even deeper into the lightless bowels of Manhattan with no hope of rescue. Julian's steel-gray eyes sparkled with a dark, predatory light as he looked at the central clock, which now showed a total market collapse and the death of everyone in the room in exactly 60 minutes. "Gentlemen," he whispered, the sound carrying through the silence like a razor blade over silk. "Let's see who among you is truly willing to be the sole survivor of the greatest bankruptcy in human history." Just as the first man lunged toward the platform in a fit of suicidal rage, the lights plunged into total darkness, leaving only the glowing red numbers of the countdowns to illuminate the coming slaughter. The darkness within the bowels of Manhattan was not merely the absence of light. It was a thick, suffocating velvet that smelled of oxidized iron, ancient dampness, and the rotting breath of the city above, punctuated only by the rhythmic, frantic blinking of 32 crimson LED displays strapped to the chests of men who once controlled the world's indices. Julian Thorne stood motionless amidst the shadows, a ghost in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his pale, marble-like skin catching the faint, bloody glow of the countdowns like a funerary statue in a forgotten crypt. Around him, the so-called masters of the universe had regressed into primal, whimpering beasts, their expensive Italian loafers slipping on the damp grime and slick oil of the subway floor as they scrambled away from the sound of their own accelerated mortality. Julian's 6'2" frame remained an anchor of terrifying stability in the chaos, his lean and wiry silhouette casting a long, predatory shadow against the rusted steel beams of the abandoned station. "Listen to the tempo, Arthur." Julian's voice sliced through the cacophony of panicked breathing and the distant rhythmic hiss of escaping steam, his British accent cold, precise, and entirely devoid of the adrenaline currently poisoning the blood of his peers. He didn't need to see Arthur Sterling to know the man was trembling. He could hear the frantic, uneven click-clack of Sterling's timer, a mechanical heartbeat racing toward zero at 400%, the speed of a human pulse. Julian reached into his vest pocket, the Victorian silver pocket watch chain singing a faint, metallic tune as he drew out the heirloom, his thumb tracing the intricate engravings with the tactile focus of a diamond cutter. The darkness was his natural element, an extension of the void he carried within his own chest, and as he stepped forward, his salt and pepper hair remaining perfectly slicked back despite the humidity. He felt the first true spark of joy he'd known in decades. The realization that the only thing more valuable than absolute power was the crushing, mathematical certainty of impending death. "You're a monster, Julian. You're one of us. We built the foundations of this city together," Arthur Sterling screamed, the sound echoing off the cracked tiles and the shadows of the Manhattan underground, his voice cracking with a desperation that no amount of offshore liquidity or political leverage could ever soothe. A sudden, violent flare from a sparking electrical conduit illuminated Julian's face for a fleeting second. The sharp, aquiline nose, the thin, cruel lips curled into a faint smirk, and those steel-gray eyes that remained as flat and unyielding as a winter sea. Julian didn't flinch at the sparks. He merely watched the reflection of the fire dance in his pupils, a tiny, fleeting spark of warmth in his cold, gray world. "One of you?" Julian repeated, his voice a razor blade sliding over silk, leaning into the light so Sterling could see the absolute lack of empathy in his piercing gaze. "Don't insult me with your delusions of kinship, Arthur. You were always a parasite who lived on the margins of other men's labor, a tick bloated on the blood of the working class. I am the host who finally realized the infection had to be purged for the sake of the ledger." He stepped closer, the scent of his bespoke cologne, sandalwood, and cold rain clashing sharply with the stench of Sterling's fear-induced sweat. "The hostile takeover phase isn't just a clever name for this stage of our little game. It's a literal redistribution of assets. Your heart, Arthur, the one currently thumping like a trapped, panicked bird behind that glowing red LED screen, is the only thing left in this room with a positive valuation. But to save yourself, you have to prove you're willing to sacrifice the very thing you claimed to love most. Look up, Arthur. Look at the glass cage suspended directly above your head. Above them, a flickering emergency light hummed to life, revealing Sterling's teenage daughter, her face pressed against the reinforced glass, her eyes wide with a silent, screaming terror that no father should ever have to witness. "The price for another 10 minutes on your clock is her left kidney," Julian whispered, his smirk widening. "The market is open, Arthur. Will you buy or will you fold? Or will—" As the sound of Sterling's guttural sob filled the tunnel, a sickening mechanical groan vibrated through the floorboards, the grinding of ancient, rusted gears hidden behind the subway walls, engaging with the indifference of a cosmic executioner. A series of hydraulic pistons fired with a deafening hiss, and the iron floor beneath the billionaires began to tilt at a precarious angle, sliding them toward a central pit filled with jagged, rotating mechanical blades that hummed with a low-frequency vibration, a metallic growl that shook the very marrow of their bones. Julian remained perfectly balanced on a narrow, stationary ledge, his athletic body unmoving as he watched his former associates claw at the smooth, oily surface of the tilting floor, their fingernails snapping and bleeding against the cold metal. He looked down at his silver pocket watch, the Victorian craftsmanship a stark, elegant contrast to the brutal, industrial slaughterhouse he had constructed beneath the streets of New York. "Efficiency is the soul of any successful enterprise," Julian remarked to the room at large, his voice carrying over the pleas for mercy that rose like a dissonant choir from the pit. "We are merely trimming the fat, removing the redundancies that have slowed down the progress of true capital. In the end, the only thing that matters is who is left to sign the closing documents." Suddenly, a loud, metallic clack echoed through the chamber, and a heavy iron collar snapped shut around Julian's own neck, tethering him to the central pillar of the station with a heavy, reinforced chain. He didn't panic. He merely looked down at the iron around his throat. then slowly turned his head toward the shadows where a figure was emerging. Not a billionaire, but Elias, one of the illegal immigrants Julian had supposedly processed earlier in the evening. Elias held a remote detonator, his hands shaking, but his eyes filled with a righteous, burning fury that Julian found intellectually fascinating. A variable I didn't account for, Julian mused aloud, his steel-gray eyes narrowing as he assessed the new player on the board. The unseen cost finally appearing on the balance sheet. Tell me, Elias, do you intend to liquidate the CEO, or are you looking for a seat on the board? The tension in the air became a physical weight, thick with the smell of ozone, blood, and the impending chemical explosion that Julian knew was rigged to the station's main gas line as a failsafe for a total market collapse. Elias didn't speak. He simply stepped into the dim, flickering light, his tattered, dirt-streaked clothes a sharp contrast to Julian's pristine charcoal three-piece suit. The two men representing the absolute poles of the human experience, brought together by the gravity of a dying world. Julian felt the cold bite of the iron collar against his throat, a sensation that should have terrified him, but instead sent a thrill of ultimate stakes through his wiry frame, his heart beating with a steady, calculated rhythm. He reached up, slowly and deliberately, making sure Elias could see his hands, and adjusted his silk tie with a meticulousness that bordered on the psychotic, his thin-lipped smirk never wavering. You see, Elias, the beauty of the system I built is that it doesn't care who pulls the trigger, as long as the debt is settled and the books are balanced, Julian said, his voice echoing with a haunting, melodic quality amidst the screams of the dying men in the pit behind him. Adam, if you kill me now, the timers don't stop. They accelerate. You aren't saving anyone. You're just closing the market early and ensuring a total loss for every soul in this tunnel. He clicked his pocket watch shut, the sound final and sharp, like the cocking of a pistol in the silence. At that exact moment, the red LEDs on every chest in the room, including a hidden one beneath Julian's own vest, turned from a steady red to a blinding, pulsating white, and the sound of a distant, massive explosion began to rumble through the tunnel system from the north. The ceiling began to groan, dust and heavy chunks of concrete falling like gray snow as the structure groaned under the weight of the millions of tons of Manhattan soil above. Julian looked directly into Elias's eyes, his expression one of pure, predatory triumph as the first flames began to lick at the edges of the room. The final audit has begun, he whispered. Just as the floor beneath them both gave way into a roaring abyss of fire and twisted metal, leaving the fate of the butcher and his last victim hanging in a void of smoke and shattered glass. The roar of the explosion was not merely a sound, but a physical entity, a tectonic shift that turned the compressed air of the Manhattan underground into a solid wall of pressure. Yet Julian Thorne emerged from the settling debris like a phantom rising from the ruins of a failed civilization. His bespoke charcoal three-piece suit, once the impenetrable armor of a financial deity, was now a tattered shroud of dust and ash. Though he moved with a chilling, fluid grace that defied the absolute chaos of the collapsing dark exchange. The ornate Victorian aesthetic of the hidden subway station, which Julian had meticulously curated to resemble a high-stakes counting house, was now being crushed beneath the indifferent weight of millions of tons of Manhattan bedrock. He felt the warm, metallic tang of blood on his thin, cruel lips, a rare, visceral occurrence that felt like a final dividend payment from a dying market, and he tasted the ultimate correction. His steel-gray eyes, piercing even through the haze of pulverized concrete and ozone, scanned the wreckage for the flickering red pulses of the remaining timers, finding only the silence of liquidated assets and the groaning of twisted iron. The iron collar he had worn was gone, torn away by the sheer force of the blast, leaving a jagged red ring around his pale, marble-like throat, a mark of the debt he had nearly paid in full. He didn't scream, nor did he allow his wiry frame to tremble. Instead, Julian reached for the Victorian silver pocket watch chain that still clung to his vest, his fingers moving with a rhythmic precision that mirrored the dying gasps of the machinery buried beneath the rubble, confirming that even in the apocalypse, his sense of timing remained flawless. In the flickering, dying light of a ruptured gas line that hissed like a wounded serpent, Julian found his first dividend of the collapse. A former colleague, a man who had once traded billions with a flick of a finger, now pinned beneath a massive iron gear from one of the labyrinth's mechanical traps. The billionaire's eyes were wide with a primal, animalistic terror that Julian found aesthetically pleasing, a raw honesty that the boardroom had always lacked in its pursuit of polite greed. Julian leaned in close, his sharp, aquiline nose casting a hawk-like shadow against the man's soot-stained face, his thin lips curling into a smirk that was more terrifying than the encroaching fire. He spoke not of rescue or mercy, but of the cold, immutable mathematics of survival, explaining with a hauntingly calm voice how the man's remaining minutes were being siphoned off by the failing grid to power the emergency LEDs that Julian now used to navigate this tomb. He watched the countdown on the man's chest accelerate into a blur of white light, a blinding strobe in the gloom, and felt a surge of predatory triumph at the efficiency of his own design. To Julian, this wasn't murder. It was a necessary liquidation, a rebalancing of the books where the only currency left was the heat of a dying body and the finality of a closed position. He did not look away as the timer hit 0 and the mechanism within the gear hissed, a final, sharp sound that echoed through the hollowed-out tunnel like a gavel striking a bench in the highest court of faux wall, and he stepped over the fresh corpse with his salt and pepper hair still perfectly slicked back, a testament to his pathological need for order amidst the entropic decay of his empire. The deeper he descended into the shattered bowels of the exchange, the more the architecture resembled a twisted cathedral of iron and bone, where the distant screams of the trapped served as a dissonant choir for his descent. Julian's wiry frame moved through gaps in the wreckage that should have been impassable for a man of his 6'2" stature, his body bending with a serpentine agility as he sought the central hub of the Dark Exchange's mainframe. He eventually found it, a jagged spire of servers and monitors, half submerged in black, oily water that reflected the inferno raging in the upper tiers of the station. The Victorian silver pocket watch was out now, held firmly in his pale hand, its glass face cracked into a spiderweb pattern, but its golden heart still beating a frantic, uneven rhythm that Julian found intoxicating. He realized then that the explosion hadn't been a mere accident of Elias's rage, but the ultimate systemic failure he had subconsciously programmed himself, a fail-safe for when the human element became too volatile for the pure logic of the algorithm. He looked at the reflection of his own face in a shattered monitor, the high marble-like cheekbones, the hawk-like nose, and the eyes that looked like cold, hammered iron. He was the butcher, the man who had x-rayed the soul of the city and found only a ledger of debts, and as the silence of the deeper tunnels grew heavy, he felt a strange, intoxicating sense of peace. He began to hum a low Victorian dirge, his voice vibrating against the cold iron of the servers, inviting the darkness to witness the final, most private transaction of his legendary career. Suddenly, the black water at his feet began to churn and ripple, not from the falling debris of the tunnels above, but from a rhythmic, mechanical pulse emanating from a massive, market-closed LED display that hung precariously from the ceiling by a single frayed cable. The letters didn't just glow, they throbbed with a sickening, ultraviolet light that revealed the true, horrific scale of the audit Julian had orchestrated. Rows of glass cages, once suspended high above the maze, had shattered upon impact, and their occupants were no longer victims, but scavengers of the dark. He heard the wet, rhythmic slapping of footsteps in the rising water, the sound of men who had been reduced to their most basic biological imperatives, their timers having long since been replaced by a hunger that no fiat currency could ever sate. Julian's smirk did not vanish. It widened into a mask of pure, intellectual curiosity, his piercing gray eyes catching the glint of a dozen pairs of eyes reflecting the purple hue of the market-closed sign. He realized with a jolt of adrenaline that the audit wasn't over. He had simply moved from the trading floor to the slaughterhouse, and he was the only one left wearing a suit. He reached into his pocket not for a weapon, but for a small silver key attached to his watch chain, his heart beating with a frantic, exhilarating pace that matched the countdown of the world ending around him. As the first of the shadows lunged from the darkness, their fingers clawing at the fine charcoal wool of his sleeve, Julian Thorne didn't flinch. He simply looked up at the groaning ceiling, hearing the distant, muffled roar of the New York City subway passing far above, knowing that while the market had closed, the collection phase had just begun, and the butcher was about to find out exactly what his own life was worth on a truly open market. The transition from predatory architect to cornered prey was not a descent for Julian Thorne, but a refinement. As the first scavenger, a former hedge fund manager, whose hands were now stained with the iron-scented filth of the flooded tracks, lunged toward him, Julian didn't recoil. Instead, he pivoted with the grace of a matador, the silver key gripped between his knuckles like a surgical instrument. The charcoal wool of his bespoke sleeve hissed against the wet rags of his assailant, a sound lost beneath the rhythmic mechanical thrumming of the market closed sign. Julian felt the heat of the man's desperate breath, a stark contrast to his own marble-pale skin and the icy composure that dictated his every move. He realized in this moment of physical friction that the dark exchange had successfully stripped away the veneer of civilization he so despised. Here, in the rising black water of Manhattan's forgotten belly, value was no longer speculative. It was visceral. His steel-gray eyes remained fixed on the flickering LED display, tracking the micro-movements of the shadows encircling him, calculating the trajectory of their hunger with the same cold precision he once used to collapse the sterling. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was auditing the very essence of human desperation, and the results were satisfyingly grim. With a violent jerk, Julian jammed the silver key into a concealed, rusted lockbox embedded in the soot-stained pillar behind him, a relic of a 1920s signaling system he had repurposed for his endgame. The mechanism groaned, a heavy metallic shriek that echoed through the vaulted tunnels, momentarily paralyzing the circle of desperate men. As the panel slid open, it revealed not a weapon, but a secondary terminal, the heart of the butcher. This was the déclic, the true turn where the master of ceremonies becomes the sacrifice. Julian's thin, cruel lips curled into a smirk as he watched the ultraviolet light of the market-closed sign reflect off the glass screen of the terminal. He began to input a sequence of codes, his fingers dancing across the keys with a frantic, exhilarating speed that defied the encroaching chaos. Around him, the glass cages that hadn't shattered began to descend. humming with a lethal kinetic energy. He saw his former American associates, the ones who had survived the maze only to find themselves trapped in this subterranean purgatory, realize that the auction wasn't over. It had merely entered the liquidation phase. Julian felt a surge of adrenaline, a sharp, electric sting that made his wiry frame vibrate. He was finally breaking the ultimate ledger, proving that when the world burns, the only currency that matters is the audacity to strike the match. Chaos erupted as the first of the chemical tanks, hidden within the architectural marrow of the station, began to hiss, releasing a pale, translucent vapor that smelled of almonds and decay. The scavengers, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, became a singular, panicked beast. Julian felt a jagged claw of a hand tear through his silk tie, the fine fabric shredding like a dead skin, yet he remained anchored to the terminal. A former protégé, a man Julian had mentored in the art of the short sell, emerged from the gloom, his face a mask of chemical burns and primal rage. The two men, one the master of the suit, the other the masterpiece of the meat, collided in the rising water. Julian used the weight of his Victorian pocket watch as a flail, the silver chain snapping taut as it caught the light. He felt the sickening thud of metal against bone, a sound more honest than any closing bell on Wall Street. His aquiline nose flared as he inhaled the thickening air, his lungs burning with the first taste of the total audit he had prepared. The lean, athletic strength he had maintained through decades of disciplined vanity now served a singular purpose: to hold the line until the transaction reached its absolute zero. He was no longer Julian Thorne, the billionaire. He was the butcher, finally carving his own legacy out of the very ribs of the city that had birthed his greed. As the water reached his waist, swirling with the debris of broken lives and shattered glass, the terminal emitted a final, high-pitched chime that signaled the completion of the IPO, the internal purge objective. The market closed sign didn't just flicker, it underwent a violent transformation, the LED pixels reconfiguring into a countdown that mirrored the one pulsing in Julian's own arteries. 0059. 0058. The vapor was now a thick fog, turning the station into a ghostly abattoir where the screams of the dying were muffled into wet, gurgling prayers. Julian looked down at his silver pocket watch. The glass cracked, but the hands still moving with agonizing indifference. He had bet everything on this final collapse, wagering his own life against the possibility of a clean exit. The shadows were no longer attacking. They were falling, their nervous systems succumbing to the airborne toxin he had unleashed as his final dividend. Julian stood alone amidst the floating corpses of his ambition, his salt and pepper hair plastered to his forehead, his piercing gray eyes staring into the darkness of the tunnel ahead. He saw a flicker of orange light in the distance, the first spark of the chemical fire that would erase the dark exchange forever. With a final, mocking bow to the empty cages above, Julian turned toward the flames, the silver key still clutched in his hand, wondering if the devil accepted Victorian pocket watches as collateral for the next life. The air in the Manhattan void didn't just burn, it curdled. Julian Thorne stood at the epicenter of his own apocalypse, the orange glow of the chemical fire dancing in his steel-gray eyes. He didn't cough. He didn't flinch. He watched the "market closed" sign flicker with a dying electric heartbeat, the red glow casting long, skeletal shadows across the floating debris of his investments. His charcoal three-piece suit, a masterpiece of Savile Row tailoring, was now singed at the cuffs, yet he remained poised, a captain going down with a ship made of bone and ledger. He pulled the Victorian silver pocket watch from his vest, the chain snapping tight. The ticking had slowed, or perhaps his own pulse was finally syncing with the mechanical rhythm of the end. He had exhaled the meat from the bone of the world, and now the world was returning the favor, the heat peeling away the layers of his legendary arrogance until only the wiry, athletic frame of a predator remained. The tunnel groaned, a metallic shriek that sounded like the ghosts of every immigrant and debtor he'd processed finally finding their voice. Julian looked at the glass cages above, now shattered, the liquidated remains of the elite mixing with the soot of the inferno. There was a sublime symmetry to it, the ultimate merger. To Julian, this wasn't a tragedy. It was a perfect audit. He had calculated the value of every soul in the room and found them all wanting, himself included. He felt the silver key in his palm, the metal heating to a searing temperature, branding his skin with the mark of his final trade. He had wagered that humanity's greed would always outweigh its survival instinct, and as the ceiling began to rain down in chunks of concrete and twisted rebar, he smiled. It was the cruel, thin-lipped smirk of a man who had successfully shorted existence itself. When the NYPD breach team finally cut through the reinforced steel doors 3 hours later, they didn't find a crime scene. They found a monument to nihilism. The vapor had settled into a toxic frost, coating the charred remains of the dark exchange in a ghostly white powder. The market closed sign was the only thing still powered, its red LED pulsing like a low battery warning on a dead god's heart. They found the bodies, the titans of industry reduced to unrecognizable charcoal, clutching at the empty air where their fortunes used to be. But of Julian Thorne, there was only a silhouette scorched into the floor, a shadow of a 6'2" man standing defiantly against the blast. In the center of that shadow lay the Victorian pocket watch, its silver casing melted into a puddle of mercury, the hands forever frozen at the exact second the fire had consumed the oxygen. The legend of the butcher didn't end with the fire. It migrated. In the boardrooms of London and the high-rise penthouses of New York, the story of the Manhattan Dark Exchange became a whispered gospel. Julian Thorne had proven that everything, breath, blood, and the very time left in a man's chest, had a price point. He had died a winner because he was the only one who knew the house always wins when the house is on fire. As the sun rose over a somber Manhattan, the market closed sign finally flickered out, leaving the city in a cold, gray silence. The butcher was gone, but the scales he had built still tipped in the favor of the cold and the calculated. He hadn't just closed a market. He had opened a new era where the soul was just another line item on a balance sheet. The butcher's trade is complete. Did he win, or did we all lose? Subscribe and like if you felt the heat of the fire. Comment closed to witness the end. Don't miss our next dark thriller, dropping today at 2 p.m.